Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The Death Eaters have always seemed like nothing more than Voldemort's sinister puppets. But what if things were far more complicated? What if among them there existed their own code, secret initiations, an internal hierarchy, and even traitors? Today we'll follow the trail of the most dangerous wizards in the wizarding world to uncover the hidden mechanisms of their recruitment, learn how they avoided Azkaban, and understand who among them truly remained loyal to their Dark Lord. Enjoy watching. Number 1. How the Death Eaters were formed. The most social place in the wizarding world is Hogwarts, and it was there that the idea of the Brotherhood that would later become Voldemort's army was born. As Dumbledore said in The Half-Blood Prince, Tom Riddle began gathering followers even during his school years. Many of them later brought in their siblings, cousins, and even children. This was especially true in Slytherin, where students inherited their parents' beliefs, passing down darkness like a family heirloom. Influence, peer pressure, and a sense of superiority slowly turned them into the future Death Eaters. Number 2. At what age could one become a Death Eater? Some joined Voldemort's ranks as teenagers. Draco Malfoy received his dark mark between his 5th and 6th years at Hogwarts. Regulus Black died at about 18, but by then he had already served as a Death Eater for several years. Barty Crouch Jr. was around 19 when he was imprisoned in Azkaban. This suggests the minimum age for initiation was around 15 or 16, and it seems Voldemort not only allowed but actively encouraged the recruitment of young, impressionable minds. Number 3. Did the Death Eaters have a hierarchy? Voldemort's organization was not a chaotic mob of fanatics, but a strictly structured system. At the top stood the Dark Lord himself. Beneath him, his inner circle, Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange, and others entrusted with Horcruxes and critical missions. Next came about 15 active Death Eaters, those who took part in attacks and operations, such as the takeover of the Ministry. Below them were the bearers of the Dark Mark, followed by sympathizers without marks, and at the very bottom, outsiders who merely carried out Voldemort's orders without being official members. Number 4. How does the Dark Mark work? The Dark Mark was more than a symbol of loyalty. It was a connection. Burned into the left forearm of every Death Eater, it allowed Voldemort to summon them at any time. But the tattoo also had another effect. It darkened as the Dark Lord grew stronger. That's how Karkaroff realized his master was returning. The mark was not only a brand but also a tool of control, one that united all followers into a single entity bound by the will of one man. Number 5. Why did certain characters receive the mark? Severus Snape, Peter Pettigrew, and Draco Malfoy. 3 figures that raise many questions. Why give the mark to those whose loyalty might be questionable? The answer is simple. It was a means of control. The mark made double-crossing impossible. It could not be erased, nor could its bearer fully defect to the enemy's side. Even if someone tried to become a spy, the mark would forever betray their allegiance. Number 6. How did so many Death Eaters avoid Azkaban? After Voldemort's first fall, only a handful of Death Eaters ended up in prison. Although they outnumbered the Order of the Phoenix 20-1, most escaped punishment. Some, like Lucius Malfoy, claimed they had been under the Imperius Curse. Igor Karkaroff betrayed his former comrades. Snape was saved by Dumbledore's testimony. And the wealthier Death Eaters likely just bought their freedom. Justice, like magic, turned out to be controlled by those with enough influence. Number 7. What was Peter Pettigrew's status? At first glance, Pettigrew should have held a high rank. He betrayed the Potters, helped restore Voldemort, and took part in the ritual that gave the Dark Lord his body again. But reality was different. the Death Eaters despised and mocked him. After the Goblet of Fire, he was given no serious missions, and his silver hand became more a reminder of servitude than a reward. By the end, Pettigrew had sunk to the bottom of the hierarchy, a traitor enslaved by his own fear. Number 8. How many Death Eaters did Harry encounter before the Goblet of Fire? Although the word Death Eaters appeared only in The Prisoner of Azkaban, they had surrounded Harry from the very beginning. In the first book, Professor Quirrell and Snape. In the second, Lucius Malfoy. In the third, Peter Pettigrew and Walden McNair. So even without realizing it, Harry had been crossing paths with the network of Death Eaters throughout his entire time at Hogwarts, long before he understood who they really were. Number 9. What happens to a Death Eater's family if they fail? Failure under Voldemort was never private. When a Death Eater fell from grace, his entire family suffered the weight of his punishment. Lucius Malfoy learned this the hard way. After his failure in the Department of Mysteries, the proud patriarch of one of the oldest pure-blood families was stripped of all favor. In The Half-Blood Prince, even Bellatrix mocked him. You lost your wand, your reputation, and your master's trust. Voldemort humiliated Lucius publicly, reducing him to silence and fear. His once magnificent manor became a prison where the Dark Lord held meetings and prisoners alike, turning the Malfoys' home into a symbol of their disgrace. Narcissa and Draco became hostages in their own house. Voldemort used them as leverage, ensuring Lucius's obedience through their suffering. During the events of the Deathly Hallows, Narcissa's face was pale with dread as Voldemort forced Draco to commit acts beyond his will. Their wealth and lineage no longer mattered. The family existed only by the Dark Lord's mercy. Yet it was Narcissa's love for her son that broke the chain of fear. When she lied to Voldemort at the Battle of Hogwarts, whispering, "Is Draco alive?" she risked death for the sake of family. In that moment, she proved what Voldemort could never understand, that love, not fear, is the stronger magic. Number 10. Were there women among the Death Eaters? Women among the Death Eaters were rare, but those who served left unforgettable scars on the wizarding world. Bellatrix Lestrange was the embodiment of cruelty and devotion. Her laughter echoed through the corridors of Azkaban. Her eyes burned with the madness of faith. In the Order of the Phoenix, she cried out during the battle in the Department of Mysteries, "The Dark Lord will rise again, Potter," and her voice carried both triumph and worship. Bellatrix wasn't just a follower, she was Voldemort's shadow, his most loyal executioner. Her power was feared even by men twice her size, and her name became a Beis curse, whispered in fear. But she wasn't the only woman to wear the dark mark. Alecto Caro, together with her brother Amycus, became the symbol of Voldemort's regime at Hogwarts. After the school's fall, she took the post of Muggle Studies professor, turning it into a platform for hate. In the Deathly Hallows, it was Alecto who summoned Voldemort to Hogwarts with the dark mark, her trembling finger pressing the symbol that glowed like a wound. Her cruelty toward students proved that fanaticism had no gender. Though women were few among the Death Eaters, those who joined were often the most merciless, driven not by ambition, but by pure, consuming belief in their master's darkness. Number 11. What was the initiation ritual to become a Death Eater? The initiation into the Death Eaters was not a celebration. It was a surrender. No one entered Voldemort's circle without leaving a part of their soul behind. Though the ceremony was never fully described in the books, its shadows can be traced through fear and whispers. The moment of truth came when Voldemort pressed his wand to the recruit's arm. burning the dark mark into their flesh. "And mark them as mine," he said in the goblet of fire, his voice cold and triumphant. The pain was not just physical, it was a binding curse, a vow that could never be undone. From that second on, the servant's body and will belonged to him. Voldemort often attended the initiation himself. His presence tested the limits of courage and obedience. The new Death Eater would kneel before him, trembling, while the others stood in a circle of silence. The Dark Lord's red eyes searched for fear. He demanded proof of devotion, sometimes a task, sometimes a death. Rumor had it that Draco Malfoy's initiation came with a command to kill Albus Dumbledore. For a boy barely 16, that was not an order. It was a sentence. The task was impossible by design, a cruel test to bind him to Voldemort through guilt and terror. Every initiation ended in darkness, both literal and symbolic. When the mark burned on their arm, the room filled with silence, broken only by Voldemort's whisper, "You are mine." For the Death Eaters, there was no turning back after that night. The pain of the mark, the weight of their first crime, and the fear of their master became the chains that held them forever. It was not loyalty that kept them bound. It was the knowledge that freedom no longer existed. Number 12. Were there spies or double agents among the Death Eaters? Spies lived even among the Death Eaters, hidden beneath masks and oaths. The most famous of them was Severus Snape, the man who fooled everyone, both Dumbledore's allies and Voldemort himself. To the Dark Lord, Snape was a trusted servant. To Dumbledore, he was a lifeline inside enemy ranks, his every move balanced between life and death. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore told him quietly, "You are a brave man, Severus." That single sentence captured the essence of his existence, a man condemned to play both sides until the end. Snape's double life changed the course of the war and ultimately saved Harry Potter. But Snape was not alone. Igor Karkaroff, once a loyal Death Eater, turned against his own when Azkaban's shadows grew too cold. In the Goblet of Fire, he stood before the Ministry Tribunal, trembling as he named names, Antonin Dolohov, Augustus Rookwood, and others. His betrayal bought him freedom, but only for a time. When Voldemort returned, the hunted man's fate was sealed. His body was later found in a frozen shack, the dark mark carved into his skin. In Voldemort's world, even cowardice was punished with cruelty. These betrayals bred fear among the Death Eaters. No one could trust anyone. A single look, a pause, a whisper, could mean death. Voldemort's paranoia grew with each rumor of treachery. He used legilimency to read thoughts, he tortured for confessions, and he killed on suspicion alone. Yet the spies endured. Hidden shadows in a war of darkness. Their lies shaped victories, their silence cost lives, and in the end they proved that even in the heart of evil, not all masks served the same master. Number 13. Why didn't some pure-blood families join the Death Eaters? Not all pure-blood families answered Voldemort's call. Some, despite their ancient lineage, refused to kneel. The Weasley family became the most striking example of this defiance. Though purebloods for generations, they rejected the Dark Lord's obsession with blood purity. Arthur Weasley worked in the Ministry's misuse of Muggle artifacts office, a post other purebloods mocked as disgraceful. Lucius Malfoy sneered at him in the Chamber of Secrets, calling him a disgrace to wizard kind. Yet Arthur stood firm. "You will never understand the meaning of family, Lucius," he replied. His quiet courage became a symbol of moral resistance in a world consumed by fear. Voldemort's ideology promised power to those of noble blood, but not everyone saw strength in cruelty. Families like the Bones and Prewets also rejected his cause. Both were nearly wiped out during the First Wizarding War. In the Order of the Phoenix, Mad-Eye Moody said quietly, "The Prewets went down fighting, two of the best we ever had." Their deaths were not in vain. They showed the cost of defiance, but also the price of integrity. Refusing Voldemort was dangerous, yet it was the only way to remain human. Even some Slytherins quietly disagreed with the Dark Lord's madness. Andromeda Black, Bellatrix's own sister, chose love over lineage and married a Muggle-born wizard, Ted Tonks. For that, her name was burned off the Black family tapestry. Her choice shattered the illusion that all pure blood supported Voldemort. It was a scandal, but also a statement. Blood does not define worth. For Voldemort's followers, betrayal of ideology was worse than treason. The Weasleys were mocked, the Bones slaughtered, and Andromeda erased from memory. Yet their refusal proved something the Dark Lord never understood, that true strength is not in purity, but in choice. And when the final battle came, it was these families, not the proud Death Eaters, who stood on the right side of history. Number 14. Were there rules even Death Eaters couldn't break? Even in the world of chaos that Voldemort created, there were rules no Death Eater dared to break. The first and most sacred one was absolute loyalty. Doubt was betrayal. Questioning the Dark Lord, even with a glance or hesitation, meant death. Bellatrix Lestrange once hissed at Snape, "You dare question the Dark Lord's word?" Her fury was not only personal, it reflected the law of their order. Voldemort demanded faith without thought, obedience without question. Those who hesitated did not live long enough to hesitate twice. The story of Severus Snape shows how dangerous it was to appear disloyal. Though he walked the razor's edge between two worlds, his survival depended entirely on Voldemort's belief in his loyalty. When Voldemort finally began to doubt him, Snape's fate was sealed. In the Deathly Hallows, the Dark Lord whispered almost tenderly, "You have been a good and faithful servant, Severus, but only I can live forever." Seconds later, Nagini's fangs tore through him. In Voldemort's world, loyalty was a currency that expired the moment it was questioned. The second unspoken rule was silence. No one, not even the most trusted, was allowed to speak of the Horcruxes. Voldemort shared this knowledge with only a few. Bellatrix, Nagini, perhaps Lucius Malfoy. And even they did not know everything. When Harry and Hermione found one in Bellatrix's vault, it became clear how jealously this secret was guarded. "If the Dark Lord knew we had touched it," Bellatrix screamed, "he would kill us all." The Horcruxes were not just magical objects, they were fragments of Voldemort's soul, and to speak of them was to invite death. And the third rule was the most unforgiving. No one could leave. Once marked with the dark mark, there was no return. Those who tried to escape were hunted like traitors. Igor Karkaroff learned this too late. After betraying his comrades to save himself, he lived in constant fear. His body was found months later, murdered, the mark still burned into his arm. In Voldemort's army, loyalty was eternal, either in life or in death. Number 15. Who was the most loyal Death Eater? Among all of Voldemort's followers, none embodied loyalty as completely as Bellatrix Lestrange. Her devotion was not just obedience, it was worship. While others feared the Dark Lord, Bellatrix adored him. She called him the Dark Lord, with trembling reverence, her voice filled with something closer to love than fear. Even in the Order of the Phoenix, when she screams at Harry, You dare speak his name with your filthy half-blood mouth. It's clear. Her faith in Voldemort was absolute. She endured 14 years in Azkaban, surrounded by Dementors, and never betrayed him. Others, like Lucius Malfoy or Igor Karkaroff, pleaded for mercy or sought excuses. Bellatrix did not. She stood proud in the courtroom, laughing, proclaiming, "The Dark Lord will rise again, Crouch. Throw us into Azkaban. We will wait." That scene, chilling and unforgettable, revealed her madness and her unwavering loyalty. When Voldemort finally returned, Bellatrix was the first to kneel before him. He trusted her with secrets others would never hear. She guarded his Horcrux, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, and fought for him with a ferocity that frightened even her allies. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape watches her with wary eyes. Even he, the master of control, sensed her dangerous devotion. Bellatrix's loyalty was both her strength and her curse. She lived only for her master's approval, and she died for it, struck down by Molly Weasley in the Battle of Hogwarts. Her last scream wasn't one of fear, but of disbelief that her Dark Lord could be defeated. In the end, she wasn't just Voldemort's follower, she was his reflection, consumed by power, blinded by love, and destroyed by both. Number 16. Did any Death Eaters regret their actions? There are moments in history, even within the darkest of times, when a single act of conscience burns brighter than 1,000 torches of evil. In the shadowed world of Lord Voldemort's followers, the Death Eaters, few ever turned back from the path they had chosen. They had pledged loyalty sealed in blood and fear, binding themselves to a cause that promised power but delivered only destruction. Yet among them, one young man's name stands as a quiet rebellion against the darkness he once served, Regulus Arcturus Black. His was not the story of redemption shouted from rooftops, but of silent courage carried out in the shadows. Regulus grew up in the proud and ancient house of Black, where the walls themselves whispered the creed of pure-blood supremacy. To be a Black was to believe in the superiority of wizard-kind in the old ways and in the promise of dominance over those deemed lesser. His parents, Orion and Walburga, filled their home with portraits of ancestors who had never doubted their heritage. It was in this atmosphere that Regulus absorbed the ideology that would lead him to Voldemort. "The world isn't fair, Sirius," he once told his older brother, in a moment of frustration, and though the words were never recorded, they echo in the sentiment of his choices. For a time, he truly believed that following Voldemort meant restoring order to a world that had lost its balance. Unlike his brother Sirius, who rebelled against the family and fled to seek truth among those Voldemort sought to destroy, Regulus stayed. He was quiet, dutiful, and eager to please the mother who hung the Black family tapestry like a sacred text. When the Dark Lord began recruiting from old families, Regulus's loyalty was almost expected. His parents were proud, and his initiation into the ranks of the Death Eaters was not met with horror, but with satisfaction. He was young, barely out of Hogwarts, when he took the mark. And yet even at that age he possessed a heart that would one day rebel against the very thing he had sworn to serve. At first he admired Voldemort from afar, seeing in him the living embodiment of strength and purpose. To Regulus, the Dark Lord was not a murderer, but a visionary. He believed the whispers about immortality were proof that Voldemort had discovered something divine. But the illusion shattered when the cruelty began to reach into his own home. House elves, even in the most traditional families, were treated as loyal servants, never as tools for torment. When Voldemort ordered Kreacher, the Black family elf, To assist him in a dark ritual involving a mysterious locket and a cave by the sea, Regulus's faith began to die. Creature returned from that cave broken, poisoned by a potion meant to protect a secret no mortal should bear. Regulus listened to the elf's trembling voice recount the horror of being forced to drink, of being left alone to die, and something inside him shifted irrevocably. The Dark Lord has no mercy, even for those who serve, he realized. It was a moment of awakening, a quiet collapse of belief that so few Death Eaters ever reached. Voldemort's disregard for Creature's life revealed a truth Regulus could no longer deny. Their master saw them all as disposable. In that moment, regret took root, but Regulus's regret was not passive. It transformed into a dangerous resolve. He began to study the object Voldemort had hidden, the locket, which Creature described as heavy with dark power. Regulus had heard enough whispers among the Death Eaters to suspect its true nature. It was a Horcrux, a vessel for a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul. To destroy it would be to wound Voldemort himself. The thought terrified him, yet it was this very fear that confirmed his decision. He knew what must be done, even if it cost him his life. The night he prepared to return to the cave, Regulus was not driven by glory or vengeance. He sought only redemption, not before the world, but before his own conscience. "I want to do what's right this time," he told Creature, not in a speech, but as a final instruction. He ordered the elf to take him back to the cursed cave and, no matter what happened, to leave him and return home. It was the only command Creature would ever disobey, by loving his master too much to forget. The cave was a tomb of black water and despair. Regulus forced himself to drink the potion, the same poison that had nearly killed his servant. Each gulp burned like liquid fire, each swallow dragging him closer to madness. He screamed, clawed at the stone, and begged for water, and the Inferi rose from the depths. Creature tried to help, but Regulus's final command was absolute. The last thing he did was thrust the locket into the elf's hands and whisper, "Take it home, Creature!" Then the darkness consumed him. The locket he died to steal would one day become the key to Voldemort's destruction. Decades later, when Harry Potter and his friends searched for the Horcruxes, they would find that same locket, its false inscription reading RAB. The initials that once stood for a Death Eater's allegiance had become a secret symbol of defiance. In a way, Regulus Black had done what few others dared. He betrayed Voldemort not out of hatred, but out of conscience. Number 17. Could Death Eaters produce a Patronus? The question of whether Death Eaters could cast a Patronus charm has fascinated readers for years, stirring debates among scholars and fans alike. The Patronus is not just a spell, it is a manifestation of the purest light, an externalization of one's most powerful and positive emotions. In contrast, Death Eaters lived in darkness, both figuratively and literally. They were bound by fear, hatred, and ambition, emotions that suffocate joy. When we consider the mechanics of the Patronus, we quickly understand why this spell was nearly impossible for those who served Lord Voldemort. The Patronus charm, Expecto Patronum, requires the caster to focus on a single, overwhelmingly happy memory. It demands clarity, hope, and belief that good can triumph. As Lupin once explained to Harry, "The Dementor will feed on you long before you manage to conjure a proper Patronus." This explains why the spell is so revealing. It exposes the nature of the soul behind the wand. For a Death Eater, whose mind is filled with cruelty and allegiance to evil, the emotional foundation required for a Patronus simply doesn't exist. Even if they tried, their wands would spark only a faint, silvery mist, a ghost of light that cannot take shape. Consider Bellatrix Lestrange, whose loyalty to Voldemort bordered on obsession. Could she have produced a Patronus? It seems inconceivable. Her joy came from inflicting pain, from the madness of serving darkness. Her laughter in the Department of Mysteries, echoing after Sirius fell through the veil, was not the laughter of happiness. It was the laughter of a fractured soul. Such a person cannot call upon warmth or light. Even her moments of victory were soaked in the venom of cruelty. To summon a Patronus, one must love truly and selflessly. Bellatrix only loved Voldemort, and even that love was corrupted by servitude and hunger for approval. Lucius Malfoy presents another compelling example. He was not driven by madness, but by ambition and fear. His loyalties shifted with the tides of power, and though he adored his family, he was never free from cowardice. Could a man motivated by survival rather than conviction find the emotional strength for a Patronus? Lucius's fear of losing status outweighed his capacity for hope. His brand of love was conditional, fragile under pressure. When Voldemort returned, Lucius trembled before him. When Voldemort fell, he trembled before the Ministry. Such instability leaves no room for inner peace, and without peace, light cannot exist. Draco Malfoy's case invites more sympathy. Unlike his father, Draco experienced doubt. During his 6th year at Hogwarts, he was tasked with a murder he could not commit, and his heart crumbled under the burden. Here we see flickers of humanity, a potential for light. But even then, Draco's fear and shame were too great. His remorse came too late, and though he later sought redemption, he was never trained to nurture joy. The dark arts leave scars on the soul. They corrupt even the simplest emotions. Draco, who had grown up in a house where pride replaced affection, might have longed for light, but longing is not enough. Rowling herself once remarked that Death Eaters would have had no use for Patronuses, and even if they attempted the spell, they would be unable to summon it properly. The idea is rooted in moral logic. A Patronus does not merely require happiness, it requires purity of intent. It is not enough to recall a pleasant moment. The caster must believe in good, in love, in the sanctity of life. This is why even powerful wizards like Voldemort could never conjure one. The Dark Lord's magic was immense, but it was built on domination and fear. His greatest joy came from conquest, and conquest is a hollow source of light. Severus Snape, however, is the great contradiction, the single exception that redefines the discussion. His life was drenched in darkness, betrayal, guilt, and self-loathing. Yet within him burned a single, indestructible emotion: love. His love for Lily Potter, unrequited and eternal, became the source of his Patronus. When he cast it, a silver doe emerged, mirroring Lily's own. It was not a symbol of joy, but of sorrow redeemed through devotion. Snape's Patronus was the embodiment of the only pure thing left in him. Dumbledore once observed, "After all this time?" And Snape's reply, always, captured the paradox of his soul. That one word held more light than 1,000 incantations. This reveals something profound about the Patronus charm. It is not exclusively tied to happiness, but to emotional truth. Snape's memories were filled with pain, yet his love transformed that pain into power. His Patronus was not born from laughter or victory, but from loyalty that survived despair. No Death Eater shared that kind of love. Their bonds were transactional, forged in ambition and fear. Even those who professed loyalty to Voldemort did so to avoid punishment or to gain power. None of them loved him as Snape loved Lily. That difference defined their magical limitations. If we imagine for a moment that a Death Eater tried to produce a Patronus, the result would be revealing. The silver mist that flickered briefly before fading would expose their emptiness. The Dementors, drawn to suffering, would consume the little warmth that remained. Perhaps some, like Narcissa Malfoy, who lied to Voldemort to protect her son, might have stood a chance. Her act in the Forbidden Forest, declaring Harry Potter dead when he was not, was born from maternal love. That love, fragile and desperate, was her light. Narcissa may not have known the spell, but in that moment she performed magic more powerful than any incantation. She saved her family through compassion, not cruelty. Number 18. Why didn't Voldemort forgive failure? In the shadow of the flickering torches of Malfoy Manor, in the hushed gloom of the inner sanctum of the Death Eaters, one fact stands clear. Lord Voldemort did not forgive mistakes. He did not tolerate failing subordinates. His world was one of absolute command. This ruthlessness was not simply cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was the vivid expression of his fear of losing power and his conviction that mercy equals weakness. He believed iron discipline and terror would bind his followers to him better than loyalty ever could. For Voldemort, the mechanics of control were non-negotiable. From the early days of his first rise to power, Voldemort surrounded himself with men and women who bent their wills to his. But those same followers, and Lucius Malfoy, Peter Pettigrew, Bellatrix Lestrange, and others, soon learned that service to the Dark Lord came with no margin of error. In the vault of the Horcrux, in the grave of his soul-fragmented ambition, Voldemort staked everything on the idea of total obedience. And when someone slipped up, even slightly, the result was unsparing. Punishment, humiliation, or death. Punishment was the rule, mercy the exception, and only when it served his design. The rationale behind this behavior is straightforward. Voldemort's obsession with power, immortality, and supremacy left no room for mistakes. He believed that a leader who forgives sets a precedent of weakness. He believed that any crack in the facade of invincibility invites collapse. In his own words, there is no good and evil, there is only power and those too weak to seek it. This chilling philosophy reveals the core of his intolerance. Mistakes were not errors to correct, they were threats to his dominion. Take the case of Peter Pettigrew. After his betrayal of the Potters, Pettigrew became something of a cautionary tale. Voldemort rewarded him with the silver hand, yet that same object became an instrument of immediate accountability. When Pettigrew showed a moment of hesitation or pity, a human weakness, the hand strangled him. This gruesome outcome sent a message: loyalty must be perfect and unwavering. Such an example illustrates how even among the inner circle there was no safe harbor for the flawed. Another instance is Lucius Malfoy, who in the aftermath of the failed attack at the Department of Mysteries found himself not rewarded but humiliated, his authority shaken. Voldemort let him know that past status counted for nothing unless his performance remained flawless. This showed the operative system your value rested only in your current utility to the Dark Lord. Any mark of failure put you at risk. Mercy, a part of the equation. What sustained this dynamic was fear. A deliberate, structured fear. Voldemort believed that punishment was the most effective motivator. The idea of a gracious leader who forgives and nurtures was alien to him. Instead, he sought to keep his followers in a constant state of alertness and anxiety. One misstep, and the consequences would be immediate and visible. This atmosphere of tension meant the Death Eaters operated under a high-wire act of obedience. They performed not because they felt affection for their leader, but because they feared what would happen if they faltered. The fear was deployed not only as threat, but as performance guarantee. Voldemort's logic: a follower who fears being punished will be more effective than one who is simply trusted. So if Bellatrix Lestrange executed a mission, she did so with ruthless zeal, not simply devotion, but the knowledge that any mercy toward failure would be disastrous. She lived the truth of his code. Mistakes were intolerable. That is how Voldemort built his regime. Yet this tactic, while effective for building rapid obedience, carried within it the seeds of collapse. An organization held together only by fear lacks loyalty of the heart. The members become actors, not allies. The constant dread of failure and punishment bred internal fractures, whisperings of betrayal, hidden self-preservation, mission fatigue. In the case of the Death Eaters, this tension precipitated confessions, desertions, and ultimately the failure of the system in the final battle. Consider the scene in which Voldemort announces to his followers after the Battle of Hogwarts that the boy who lived is dead and the world must bend to him. His speech emphasizes absolute dominance, but does it show trust in his followers? No, it shows his need to display power, as if to reassure himself more than to inspire them. The followers standing there did so not wholeheartedly, but because they feared what would happen if they did not. That fear tethered the bond, but also made it brittle. Moreover, Voldemort's refusal to recognize mistakes as human is telling. He refused to believe that even his most devoted servants could err and still be redeemed. Mercy was anathema to him because mercy acknowledged equality, humanity, and vulnerability, all qualities he disdained. He perceived mercy as weakness. The moment a Death Eater hoped for forgiveness instead of punishment, he feared that the chain of command would slacken, rebellion could germinate, and his dominion would suffer. The cost of this philosophy was high. When an atmosphere of terror dominates internal relationships, trust evaporates. Effective collaboration gives way to self-preservation. Death Eaters began guarding their own backs. Some even speculated whether the Master was truly invincible, whether his dominance could be challenged if even he punished his own. That doubt is poison to a totalitarian structure of fear. And indeed, the cracks appeared. Number 19. What happened to the Death Eaters after Voldemort's fall? The fall of Lord Voldemort did not end with a single flash of green light. When his lifeless body struck the cold floor of the Great Hall, the echo carried through the ruins of Hogwarts, but it did not erase the years of fear, loyalty, and blood that had bound the Death Eaters to their master. The chaos that followed the battle was filled with smoke, shattered spells, and bodies that bore the mark of both triumph and ruin. For some, it was a moment of freedom. For others, the beginning of reckoning. The dark marks still lingered on their arms, a brand that now meant shame instead of power. In the days after Voldemort's fall, the Ministry of Magic, under Kingsley Shacklebolt's leadership, moved quickly to restore order. Aurors, exhausted yet relentless, swept through the ruins and the villages beyond, rounding up those who had sworn allegiance to the Dark Lord. Lucius Malfoy was among the first brought in, his wand trembling in his hand as he surrendered it to the authorities. He had already betrayed the cause by refusing to fight during the final battle, and his cooperation saved his family. Narcissa Malfoy's defiance, when she lied to Voldemort about Harry Potter's death to protect her son, became their redemption. Draco, pale and silent, faced questioning but was never charged. The Malfoys withdrew to Malfoy Manor, their grand estate now more a prison of guilt than a home of luxury. Not all Death Eaters were so fortunate. Bellatrix Lestrange lay dead beside the remains of her master's ambitions, struck down by Molly Weasley in an act that burned through years of terror. "Not my daughter, you BH!" were the last words Bellatrix heard, and her death symbolized the collapse of the fear that had once suffocated the wizarding world. Others met their ends in less dramatic ways. Antonin Dolohov, who had murdered countless innocents, fell during the final hours of the battle, struck by curses from multiple defenders. His body, they said, was still smiling faintly, as though he had found peace in destruction. Those who survived faced a justice that was swifter than many expected. The Ministry trials of 1998 became infamous for their intensity. Witnesses stood before the Wizengamot, recounting years of horror and servitude. Some Death Eaters claimed they had acted under the Imperious Curse, echoing the same defense that had been used after the First Wizarding War. But this time the court was less forgiving. Thorfinn Rawle, Walden McNair, and Corbin Yaxley were sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban. The prison, now stripped of Dementors after their allegiance to Voldemort, became a place of silence and remorse rather than despair. Some prisoners reportedly went mad, not from the presence of monsters, but from the absence of purpose. Yet not all were captured. A handful of Death Eaters vanished into the shadows before the Aurors could find them. Among them was the brutal Alecto Caro, last seen fleeing through the Forbidden Forest, and her brother Amicus, who disappeared into the Muggle world disguised under false names. Rumours said they worked as janitors in a London hospital, unable to use magic without drawing attention. Others whispered that they continued their dark rituals in secret, clinging to the illusion that their master would one day return. For years, strange markings appeared on walls in Knockturn Alley. "He's not gone," they read in ash and soot. Most dismissed them as the work of fanatics, but for some, they were reminders that darkness never dies entirely. The name of Severus Snape hung in the air like a ghost. His death inside the shrieking shack left many uncertain of his true loyalties. In the aftermath, when Harry Potter revealed Snape's memories to the world, the wizarding community was divided between admiration and guilt. Snape had played both sides, marked as a Death Eater, yet guided by love and sacrifice. "Look at me," he had whispered in his final moments. And in that plea lay the tragedy of a man who had been condemned for serving the very side he helped to destroy. The Ministry never added his name to the list of criminals, but neither did they celebrate him publicly. His portrait did not hang beside the heroes, and perhaps that was how he would have wanted it. Other names faded quietly from record. Not Mulciber and Travers, all captured, spent their remaining years behind Azkaban's steel doors. Some, like Theodore Nott's father, died in custody before trial. The next generation, however, grew up in a different world. Many of the children of Death Eaters faced suspicion at Hogwarts. They carried the burden of their surnames like chains. Draco Malfoy's hesitant smile at Platform 9 3/4, years later, told a silent story of survival, guilt, and the desire to move on. The war had scarred not only bodies, but entire families. Among the most tragic figures was Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf who had served Voldemort not for ideology but for the promise of chaos, was captured after months of hiding in the mountains of Scotland. The Aurors found him surrounded by remnants of his last pack. He was sentenced not to Azkaban, but to a specialized magical containment center, where he reportedly lost the ability to transform. His final years were marked by rage and confusion. Some said he spent his nights howling at walls that no longer echoed back. The world after the Battle of Hogwarts tried to heal, but scars ran deep. Many witches and wizards discovered that the Death Eaters were not an extinct breed, but a reflection of the darker instincts that linger in every society. Some sought redemption. One lesser-known Death Eater, Reginald Avery, offered to help the ministry identify secret caches of dark artifacts hidden across Britain. His cooperation led to the recovery of cursed relics that could have reignited terror. Avery lived under ministry supervision until his death, always under watch, always distrusted. In Knockturn Alley, years later, whispers of the last mark began to circulate. It referred to a mysterious group of former Death Eaters who had sworn to never use magic again. They gathered only once a year on the anniversary of Voldemort's death, lighting a single candle in memory of what they had lost, not power, but their souls. Some believed it to be a myth, but others claimed to have seen a faint glow on those nights near the ruins of Malfoy Manor. Even decades after the war, Harry Potter himself remained haunted by what he had seen. During his time as head of the Auror office, he oversaw the pursuit of the last known fugitives. One of his reports, now stored in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, ended with a single line: "Evil does not vanish, it sleeps, waiting for neglect." He knew that victory was not about destroying darkness, but preventing it from growing again. His dedication ensured that no new Dark Lord would rise while he lived. The wizarding community learned over time that the Death Eaters were not simply villains, they were also reminders of fear's power. Many of them had once been students, neighbors, even friends. Their transformation into servants of evil had been gradual, fueled by promises of superiority and the seduction of control. The lesson remained that evil rarely begins in the open, it begins with silence, with small compromises. As Dumbledore once said, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Those words became the cornerstone of a new generation's education. There were still those who believed in Voldemort's ideals, though they no longer dared to act. Pamphlets appeared occasionally, speaking of the purity of magic and the legacy of the dark. The ministry treated them as minor threats, but Harry saw them differently. He had seen how ideas, once dismissed, could fester. In a rare interview years later, he remarked, "I do not think we ever defeat the Death Eaters. We only remind people why they must never return." Time dulled the memories, but not the echoes. The Great Hall was rebuilt, the portraits restored, and laughter returned to Hogwarts. Yet for those who had lived through that night, the shadow of the dark mark would always flicker in their dreams. Some claimed to have seen it faintly reappear in the sky on stormy nights, as if the magic of old refused to die. Whether it was imagination or warning, none could say. The story of the Death Eaters after Voldemort is not one of finality, but of reflection. Some found redemption, others perished or hid, and a few continued to chase ghosts of power long gone. What united them all was the realization that the man they followed was mortal after all, and that their fear of him had been their own prison. In the end, the question of what happened to the Death Eaters is less about their fate and more about the world they left behind, a world determined never again to bow to the darkness that once called itself immortal. Number 20. Why did Voldemort assign Draco Malfoy such a crucial task? When Voldemort summoned the Death Eaters to Malfoy Manor at the beginning of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, the atmosphere was heavy with humiliation. Lucius Malfoy, once among the Dark Lord's most trusted followers, was no longer the proud, confident man who had strutted through the halls of the Ministry of Magic. He had failed at the Department of Mysteries. His wand had been confiscated. He had been imprisoned in Azkaban, and when Voldemort returned to power, Lucius had been spared only because he remained useful, as an example of what happened to those who disappointed their master. Voldemort's cold amusement when he turned his attention to Lucius's son was more than cruelty, it was strategy. Draco Malfoy at 16 had been raised on the mythology of blood purity and family prestige. To him, Voldemort was not a monster, but a distant and terrifying godlike figure who embodied the ideals the Malfoys claimed to revere. When Voldemort announced that Draco would be tasked with killing Albus Dumbledore, it sounded like an honor. In reality, it was a death sentence. The Dark Lord's words, "You shall prove yourself, Draco, or pay the price," were meant to cut deeper than any curse. He knew exactly what he was doing. Behind the appearance of rewarding Draco lay a cruel motive. Voldemort wanted to punish Lucius through his son. Lucius had failed him in the Department of Mysteries, allowing the prophecy to be destroyed and losing several Death Eaters in the process. In the twisted hierarchy of Voldemort's world, failure was unforgivable. The Dark Lord did not simply kill those who disappointed him. He dismantled their lives, stripped them of dignity, and left them broken before their peers. Giving Draco this impossible mission was Voldemort's way of ensuring that the Malfoys would live every day in terror, knowing that their son was doomed and powerless to escape his fate. The genius of Voldemort's cruelty lay in how personal it was. He understood the psychology of fear better than anyone. Lucius's pride had always been in his influence, his name, and his son, and Voldemort targeted exactly those things. When Narcissa Malfoy begged for her son's safety, Voldemort ignored her tears with a smile that revealed how much he enjoyed watching the proud family crumble. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, Narcissa's sister and Voldemort's most fanatical servant, mocked the Malfoys, sneering that the Dark Lord gave Draco the task only because he wanted to see him fail. Her taunting words, "He's playing with you, sissy, you know he is," were painfully true. For Voldemort, control was never maintained through loyalty, it was maintained through terror. The Death Eaters followed him not out of love or respect, but because they feared his wrath more than anything else. By forcing Draco into this deadly mission, Voldemort reminded all of them that no one was beyond his reach. Even a family as old and influential as the Malfoys could be reduced to trembling servants in a moment. Every Death Eater in that room understood the message. Failure would not only destroy you, it would destroy everything you loved. Draco himself became a symbol of that cruelty. Once the arrogant boy who strutted through Hogwarts halls, he began to deteriorate visibly. His pale face grew thinner, his confidence turned to paranoia. He spent his days obsessively repairing the vanishing cabinet in the Room of Requirement, a desperate attempt to create a passage for Death Eaters to enter Hogwarts. His behavior reflected a psychological collapse that was both fascinating and tragic. In one of the most telling scenes, when Harry spies on Draco crying in the bathroom, we see the truth. Beneath his arrogance, he was a frightened child, crushed under impossible pressure. Voldemort had never expected Draco to kill Dumbledore himself. The task was deliberately designed to be impossible. Albus Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of the age, protected by magic and allies. For a 16-year-old to assassinate him inside Hogwarts was absurd. Voldemort's intent was not success, but demonstration. If Draco died trying, it would humiliate Lucius and prove Voldemort's power to the rest. If he somehow succeeded, it would be a bonus. But Voldemort's true goal had already been achieved: fear. Snape's role in this plan reveals another layer of Voldemort's calculation. Snape was ordered, or rather manipulated, into making an unbreakable vow with Narcissa to protect Draco and finish the job if he failed. Voldemort knew about the vow, or at least suspected it, and used it to test Snape's loyalty as well. Two birds with one curse. Draco's mission would expose the Malfoys' desperation and Snape's true allegiance. If Snape refused to act, Voldemort would know he could not be trusted. If Snape killed Dumbledore, the Dark Lord would gain the victory he desired while still punishing Lucius through guilt and disgrace. Voldemort's manipulation reached its peak when we consider the symbolic weight of the task itself. Killing Dumbledore meant destroying the only figure in the wizarding world who posed a moral and intellectual challenge to him. Assigning that act to Draco, a child, was like turning innocence into a weapon. Voldemort delighted in corruption, in taking what was pure or youthful and twisting it into something dark. Draco's transformation from school bully to would-be murderer reflected the rot that Voldemort spread through every life he touched. But even in his cruelty, Voldemort underestimated something crucial: human emotion. He believed that fear and pride were the only forces that mattered. He did not understand compassion. Narcissa's desperation led her to do something no Death Eater had ever done. She went to Snape and begged him for mercy. Her plea and Snape's eventual act of killing Dumbledore were both born not out of loyalty to Voldemort, but out of love and mercy twisted into survival. Voldemort's plan succeeded in punishment, but it failed in control. The Malfoys no longer served him willingly, they served only out of terror. The night on the astronomy tower proved this. When Draco finally cornered Dumbledore, wand shaking, he could not do it. The boy's trembling hands and whispered words, "You're in my power, but I don't have a choice," revealed the hollow triumph of Voldemort's design. Dumbledore, weak but calm, spoke to Draco with understanding, even pity. He saw that Draco's soul was still intact, barely, but enough to resist murder. In that moment, the difference between Voldemort's world and Dumbledore's was laid bare. One ruled through fear, the other through empathy. When Snape appeared and cast the fatal Avada Kedavra, it was both the fulfillment and the collapse of Voldemort's plan. Dumbledore was dead, yes, but Draco had been spared the irreversible act of murder. Voldemort had wanted to break him. Instead, Draco survived, haunted but human. Lucius and Narcissa, though disgraced, remained united by love for their son, a bond that even the Dark Lord's terror could not sever. In the end, Voldemort's cruelty produced not loyalty, but quiet rebellion. The other Death Eaters watched the Malfoys' downfall closely. To them, the lesson was unmistakable. Voldemort's favor was a curse, his rewards were traps. Those who rose in his ranks did so on the corpses of their own dignity. When the Dark Lord punished Lucius by turning his son into a pawn, he made every Death Eater glance nervously at their own family. The Malfoys' suffering became a silent warning whispered in every dark corridor: "You are not safe, even if you serve him." Later, during the events of the Deathly Hallows, this lesson reached its climax. The Malfoys' home became Voldemort's headquarters, a gilded prison for a family that once revelled in luxury. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione were captured and brought to the manor, Draco could barely look at them. His fear was palpable. By then, the proud Malfoy heir had learned the true cost of serving darkness. His hesitation to identify Harry in front of the Death Eaters showed how deeply Voldemort's test had changed him. He had no courage left for cruelty. Ironically, Voldemort's supposed punishment created his own undoing. The Malfoys' loyalty disintegrated. When the final battle came, they fought not for Voldemort, but for Draco's safety. Narcissa lied to the Dark Lord's face in the Forbidden Forest, declaring Harry dead when she knew he lived, a betrayal that sealed Voldemort's doom more surely than any spell. The chain of cruelty he had forged around them snapped under the weight of maternal love, something he could neither comprehend nor destroy. In the end, Voldemort's decision to assign Draco the task of killing Dumbledore revealed more about his philosophy than any speech could. He ruled through fear, mistrust, and humiliation. He believed that pain was the strongest form of loyalty. Yet his inability to understand empathy became his greatest weakness. Draco's failure, Lucius's despair, and Narcissa's defiance all sprang from the same source. Love, a force Voldemort had dismissed as weakness, but which ultimately defeated him. Thus, when fans wonder why Voldemort chose Draco Malfoy for such a mission, the answer lies not in strategy but in sadism. He wanted to make an example. He wanted to remind his followers that their children, their pride, their very humanity, belonged to him. Every act of defiance would be repaid with despair. Yet in the cruelest twist of fate, that same act of punishment became the spark of Voldemort's downfall. For the Malfoys, once the proud face of his inner circle, proved that even in the darkest times, fear could be conquered by love. And that was a truth the Dark Lord would never understand. Number 21. Did Death Eaters have access to forbidden magic? It is impossible to speak of the Death Eaters without confronting the truth that their power extended far beyond ordinary dark charms. Theirs was a world of forbidden knowledge, of secrets whispered in the shadowed corners of wizarding history. Lord Voldemort's followers did not merely obey, they sought mastery over the limits of magic itself. Many wizards feared the unforgivable curses, but for the Death Eaters, they were only the beginning of a descent into the abyss. They treated the dark arts not as tools of war, but as a sacred path to domination. Their loyalty to Voldemort was founded on the promise of power drawn from the oldest and most forbidden sources, a power that the Ministry of Magic had long declared extinct. The use of the unforgivable curses was only the outer layer of their arsenal. The Cruciatus curse, which could reduce a victim to madness, was performed not only to inflict pain, but to extract energy through suffering. Bellatrix Lestrange, Voldemort's most devoted follower, believed that pain could open gateways in the human soul. She once shouted during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, "I want to see the light leave your eyes," not as mere cruelty, but as part of her own twisted belief that death was a ritual of purification. Behind her, madness was discipline, and behind her discipline was knowledge. Rumors in wizarding circles spoke of her study of ancient texts on blood magic, recovered from the ruins of Nurmengard after Grindelwald's fall. Bellatrix was said to have used her own blood in rituals to bind her wand's core more tightly to her will, a form of sympathetic magic long banned by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The Death Eaters' engagement with forbidden magic reached its height during the First Wizarding War. Voldemort himself encouraged the study of necromancy, the dark art of manipulating the essence of the dead. The inferi that guarded the Horcrux in the cave were the most horrifying evidence of this practice. But what many forget is that creating an inferius was not simply a matter of casting a spell. It required alchemical preparation of the corpse, preservation through enchanted embalming salts, and the infusion of a cursed soul fragment. Only a few of Voldemort's inner circle were trusted with such knowledge. Among them was Antonin Dolohov, whose dueling spells were infamous for leaving their victims bleeding internally, as though life itself were being torn from them. It is said that Dolohov's incantations drew power from the same principles that animated the dead, a resonance between the magic of destruction and the magic of reanimation. The Ministry of Magic never admitted how much of its own knowledge of the dark arts came from confiscated Death Eater materials. After the Battle of Hogwarts, several sealed rooms in the Department of Mysteries contained tomes so dangerous that even the unspeakables refused to open them. Within these, investigators reportedly found evidence of ritualistic transformations, attempts to merge animal and human forms without animagus training. The results were grotesque, unstable hybrids. One file described a creature found in the ruins of a safe house near Godric's Hollow, bearing a human face fused into the body of a serpent. Whether this experiment belonged to Voldemort himself or one of his followers remains uncertain, but the signature on the parchment bore the initials AD, possibly Dolohov. Beyond individual acts of cruelty, the Death Eater's magic represented an ideology that power should not be limited by moral boundaries. They saw themselves as heirs to the ancient wizards of the old kingdoms who wielded both life and death with equal command. Voldemort's speeches were often laced with phrases taken from archaic magical texts. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore recalls how Tom Riddle collected trophies, not out of sentiment but as symbols of conquest. Those trophies, objects taken from victims, were sometimes used as conduits in ritualistic spells. The practice echoed an ancient form of sympathetic magic where the possession of an object could give control over its owner's essence. For Voldemort and his followers, each act of murder and possession was not just violence, it was a ceremony of dominance. The use of blood was central to the Death Eater's forbidden magic. In contrast to the Ministry's sanitized spell work, their rituals treated blood as the purest channel of magical power. It is no coincidence that Voldemort regained a body using Harry's blood in a ceremony described with eerie precision in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. That act was not improvisation, it was the culmination of years of study into blood-binding magic. Bellatrix Lestrange and her husband Rodolphus were rumoured to have conducted similar experiments in Malfoy Manor, using blood to strengthen loyalty oaths. When Snape warned that fidelity is a dangerous thing to tamper with, he likely referred to these very rituals. The Death Eaters had found a way to turn devotion into enchantment, making betrayal impossible without death. Some of the forbidden arts they practiced bordered on alchemy. While ordinary alchemists sought transformation of metals, the Death Eaters aimed to transform souls. Dolohov and Rabastan Lestrange experimented with potions known as echo draughts, mixtures capable of trapping echoes of magical energy. These concoctions, if used on a dying wizard, could capture fragments of their last spell and store it within the drinker's body. This made certain Death Eaters terrifying opponents in combat, their very breath infused with remnants of previous curses. After the war, fragments of these alchemical journals were found among the ruins of Riddle House. One note contained the chilling line, "Power must circulate. The vessel must be willing to bear its own corruption." The Death Eater's access to forbidden knowledge was partly due to Voldemort's unique ability to command ancient magic. He was not merely a user of dark spells, he was an architect of new ones. His study of Horcruxes, described by Dumbledore as the darkest of all magic, involved research into rituals so old that even the oldest wizarding libraries had forgotten their origins. Yet, Voldemort's genius was not in discovery alone, but in teaching. He distributed fragments of knowledge among his followers, ensuring that no single one could rival him, but together they could enact nearly any dark ritual. This created an ecosystem of shadow scholarship, Death Eaters exchanging scrolls, deciphering runes, performing experiments that blurred the line between the living and the dead. One particularly disturbing area of their expertise involved emotional manipulation through enchanted sound. Lucius Malfoy allegedly funded research into resonance charms capable of inducing fear or euphoria in listeners. During the Second Wizarding War, several reports mention masked figures entering towns at night, whispering words that caused entire households to fall into nightmares. It was as if terror itself had been weaponized. This was no mere illusion. These spells were rooted in ancient, necromantic chants designed to draw out the soul's most primal instincts. The screams that haunted victims afterward were said to continue even after the curse was broken. The knowledge they possessed extended into the field of magical architecture. The dark mark, a symbol burned into the sky, was more than a warning. It was a form of sigil magic. Every time it was cast, it absorbed traces of magical energy from the surrounding area, feeding back into its caster. Over time, this created places of power where dark spells became stronger. During the occupation of Hogwarts in the Deathly Hallows, the castle itself responded differently to magic. Certain corridors felt thick with air, as though the stones remembered fear. This was the legacy of repeated sigil work. The Death Eaters had turned their symbols into self-sustaining sources of magical influence. Even within their ranks, however, there were degrees of knowledge. The Lestranges, Dolohov and Mulciber belonged to what some survivors later called the inner circle of the Veil. They were the ones who handled experiments involving the Department of Mystery's Veil, the archway that separates the living from the dead. According to one unspeakable, traces of spellwork found near the Veil bore resemblance to runes known only to the Death Eaters. It suggests they attempted to communicate with spirits beyond death, perhaps to enslave them. The Veil itself seemed to respond, whispering names during the days following the department's destruction. This, too, was knowledge beyond the grasp of any ordinary wizard. Among all of them, Bellatrix stood as a symbol of the Death Eater's mystical extremes. Her devotion to Voldemort was not merely fanaticism, it was worship. In her private chambers at Malfoy Manor, recovered after her death, auras found sigils drawn in blood, depicting serpents devouring their own tails. These represented the eternal cycle of power and sacrifice. Her magic thrived on her pain, on her belief that suffering refined the soul. She was said to have once performed a ritual called the Serpent's Bloom, where she offered part of her own life force to strengthen a curse. When she fought Hermione in the final battle, her eyes burned not only with hatred, but with the residue of those self-inflicted enchantments. The legacy of the Death Eaters' forbidden magic did not die with them. Fragments of their spells continue to surface in the black markets of Nocturne Alley, their incantations distorted but still dangerous. Auras whisper that some young wizards fascinated by power have begun to collect these remnants, believing they can wield what Voldemort's followers once did. Yet history shows that the dark arts always exact a price. As Dumbledore once said, "Do not pity the dead, Harry, pity the living, and above all, those who live without love." Perhaps that was the final difference between the Death Eaters and the rest of the magical world. They sought mastery over death, but in doing so, they abandoned everything that made life worth protecting. Number 22. Why did some Death Eaters return to Voldemort despite fear? When Voldemort returned to power, the wizarding world trembled. Yet, among the trembling, there were those who felt a rush of long-forgotten purpose. The dark mark burned again, and for some it was like the beating of an old heart they had buried but never silenced. Not every Death Eater returned out of fear. Fear was only the surface. Beneath it lay something more dangerous, belief. The pure blood ideology that Voldemort preached had sunk deep into the veins of wizarding society long before he appeared. For men like Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange, his vision was not madness, it was order. It was the restoration of a world where blood meant destiny and power was the natural right of those born to it. Lucius Malfoy, for instance, was not a coward hiding behind fear. He had always believed in superiority, the idea that Muggle-borns diluted the sacred bloodline of wizards. His elegant manners masked a deep conviction that the old order had been wronged. Voldemort offered him something the Ministry never could, a cause that flattered his pride. When he bowed before the Dark Lord, it was not merely out of submission, but reverence. Years later, when Voldemort fell, Lucius tried to wash the stain away, pretending to be one of those who had been under the Imperious curse. But in the privacy of Malfoy Manor, the memory of the dark mark still haunted him, not as shame, but as loss. Bellatrix Lestrange, unlike Lucius, did not serve for ideology alone. Her devotion bordered on worship. She saw Voldemort as something greater than a wizard, a being beyond mortality. "The Dark Lord is gone," someone once cried after his fall, but Bellatrix refused to believe it. She whispered into the silence of her Azkaban cell, "He will return. He must." And when he did, she was among the first to kneel. Her loyalty was not born of fear, but of faith, a dark mirror of the devotion others gave to Dumbledore. Bellatrix's magic flared with fury when she fought for him, not for herself, but for what she considered sacred truth. To her, Voldemort's cause was divine retribution against the weakness of the wizarding world. "He taught us to be strong," she once declared, her eyes blazing with something that was not sanity, but conviction. For many Death Eaters, Voldemort's ideology provided identity in a world they no longer recognized. After his first defeat, they had been reduced to shadows of their former selves, aristocrats stripped of influence, radicals without a leader. Some hid among respectable society, pretending to despise the very name they once glorified. Yet, when Voldemort's mark seared upon their arms again, it was as if he had called them home. The mark was more than a symbol, it was a bond. It pulsed with a sinister reminder that their loyalty was not merely a choice, it was an addiction. For those who bore it, returning to Voldemort was like surrendering to gravity. Take the case of Igor Karkaroff. Once a proud Death Eater, he betrayed his comrades to save himself. Yet even as he fled across the frozen north, the terror of the mark never left him. When the dark mark began to burn again, Karkaroff knew what it meant. His flight was not just from Voldemort, but from the piece of himself that still belonged to him. "It's back," he said once, trembling. "The dark mark, it's burning again." That burning was not physical pain. It was guilt, memory, and the whisper of something that refused to die. Others, like the Carrow twins, Alecto and Amicus, returned because cruelty had become their comfort. They found joy in domination, pleasure in the suffering of those weaker than themselves. For them, Voldemort's rise was an opportunity to unleash what they had kept hidden in the shadows. They needed no persuasion, no threat. The world he built was the one they had always desired, a place where fear was law and violence was virtue. Their classrooms at Hogwarts became torture chambers of ideology. Amicus made students watch as he punished blood traitors, while Alecto spread hatred with lectures disguised as lessons. It was not fear that guided their wands, it was purpose. For others, the return to Voldemort was more complicated. Severus Snape, for instance, was a Death Eater once, and yet his path diverged. His story was not one of devotion, nor of cowardice, but of redemption shaped by love and guilt. When he first joined the Death Eaters, Snape was seduced by the promise of belonging, of power over the humiliation he had known all his life. Voldemort's ideology gave him meaning. But after Lily Potter's death, after the prophecy he delivered led to the murder of the only person he had ever loved, the mark burned with shame. Snape's life became proof that not all who bore the mark returned willingly. Some bore it as a curse, a reminder of their own sins. There were those who returned because they had nothing else left. Men like Antonin Dolohov and Walden McNair thrived in chaos. They were soldiers, and Voldemort's war was their only home. The fall of the Dark Lord left them stranded, dangerous men with no war to fight. When Voldemort's presence returned, it was as if the world had regained its rightful rhythm. They fought not for cause nor ideology, but because battle itself was the only truth they knew. In their eyes, Voldemort's call was not a command, but an invitation to live again. The fear of Voldemort's power did play its part, but it was the kind of fear that inspired reverence. He was not merely feared as a tyrant, he was feared as an idea. Even those who hated him could not deny his magnetism. When he entered a room, time seemed to stop. When he spoke, silence obeyed. He had a way of making his followers believe that their darkest impulses were not evil, but destiny. This is why men like Lucius Malfoy hesitated to defy him even when they wanted to. As Dumbledore once said, you fail to recognize that it matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be. Voldemort twisted that truth, convincing his followers that what they were born as defined what they must become. The Dark Mark itself served as a chain of power and manipulation. Those who bore it claimed to feel his presence even in his absence. Some said he whispered to them in their dreams. Others heard his voice when they touched their wands. This mystical bond blurred the line between loyalty and possession. It was as if Voldemort had carved himself into their very souls. The mark pulsed when he was near, glowed when he was angry, and seared when he summoned. For the weak-minded, this connection became intoxicating, a constant reminder that they were chosen, marked by something greater than themselves. Even among those who wished to resist, the bond was hard to break. Narcissa Malfoy, for example, feared for her family more than she revered the Dark Lord. Her return to his service was not out of devotion, but desperation. Yet even she could not completely escape his influence. When the mark called, she felt it. When Voldemort entered her home, she bowed. And yet, in her final act, when she lied to him at the Battle of Hogwarts, claiming Harry Potter was dead, she proved that the bond could be broken by something stronger than fear: love. Her whisper to Harry, "Is Draco alive?" revealed the fragile humanity that Voldemort's power could never destroy. Perhaps that was Voldemort's ultimate failure. He inspired loyalty, but never love. He bound men and women to him through fear, ideology, and dark enchantment, but none of them would die for him willingly as Harry's friends died for each other. His Death Eaters returned because he offered them what they thought they desired: power, meaning, vengeance, but not what their souls needed. They were instruments, not companions. In the end, even those most devoted to him, like Bellatrix, perished, screaming his name, and he did not turn to save them. When Harry Potter faced Voldemort for the final time, he faced not just a man, but the sum of all these twisted loyalties. Around him lay the bodies of those who had returned to the Dark Lord, some out of devotion, some out of fear, others out of emptiness. Each of them had believed that following Voldemort would give them purpose. Yet, as their wands fell silent, one truth became clear. What they had followed was not strength, but illusion. Voldemort's power lay not in his magic alone, but in his ability to awaken the darkness already inside those who chose to serve him. In the ashes of that war, the mark faded from their arms, but the memory of its call never truly disappeared. Some said they still felt it in moments of silence, a phantom pain, a reminder of the man they once followed. The Death Eaters who returned to Voldemort did so because he answered something within them that neither the Ministry nor Dumbledore could reach, the longing to belong to something greater, even if that something was evil. It was not fear that drove them back. It was faith, pride, and the tragic need to matter in a world that had forgotten them. Number 23. Why didn't Voldemort trust even his most loyal followers? Voldemort's empire was built on fear, not loyalty. From the shadowed corridors of Malfoy Manor to the ruins of the Department of Mysteries, every Death Eater lived under a single, suffocating truth. Their master trusted no one. Even in triumph, he saw betrayal behind every bowed head. The Dark Lord's power was immense, but so was his isolation. Those who served him learned to read his silences, to tremble at his glances, because one wrong word could turn their devotion into a death sentence. Voldemort ruled not by faith in others, but by the conviction that everyone, eventually, would betray him. The roots of that distrust grew long before the world knew the name Voldemort. Tom Riddle's childhood in the London orphanage shaped him into a creature of suspicion. Surrounded by children who feared his strangeness and caretakers who offered no affection, he learned that trust was a weakness. When Dumbledore first met the young Riddle, he saw a boy who liked to collect trophies from his victims, a sign of cruelty born from loneliness. Tom never felt love, and without it, trust became alien to him. The orphanage taught him to control, to manipulate, to never rely on anyone but himself. Every relationship in his life from that moment on was a transaction of dominance. This deep-rooted fear of betrayal grew stronger when Riddle began to uncover his heritage. Learning that his father was a Muggle and had abandoned his mother was the defining wound of his existence. To a boy who already despised weakness, his father's rejection proved that love led only to humiliation. From then on, Voldemort equated dependence with danger. He once told Bellatrix Lestrange, "There is nothing worse than death," yet for him, death was not the enemy. Trust was. He created Horcruxes because he refused to let mortality, or anyone else, dictate his fate. To entrust one's soul to another being would be to admit vulnerability, and Voldemort's pride could not allow that. When he rose to power, the Death Eaters became the physical manifestation of his control. To the outside world, they were a brotherhood bound by loyalty and shared belief in magical supremacy. In truth, they were pawns in a chess game only one man played. Lucius Malfoy, with all his wealth and influence, believed his allegiance guaranteed security. Yet, after the failure in the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort turned on him with cold contempt. His words to Lucius were cutting. "You have disappointed me. I have no more use for your failures." To Voldemort, even the most powerful servant existed only until his usefulness expired. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most devoted of all, offered him worship that bordered on madness. She called him the Dark Lord with trembling reverence, fought without hesitation, and dreamed of his approval. But Voldemort saw even her adoration as something to exploit. He never reciprocated her devotion. Instead, he mocked it. Her loyalty was not rewarded with closeness, but with manipulation. He used her blind faith as a weapon. She was a torch to spread his terror, not a companion to share his confidence. When Bellatrix begged to know his plans, he ignored her because he believed that only fools confide in others. Severus Snape represented the most complex case of this mistrust. Outwardly, Voldemort considered him an ally too valuable to discard, his spy within Hogwarts, his link to Dumbledore. But inside, the Dark Lord never trusted him fully. He respected Snape's intelligence but feared it. Even when Snape risked his life to deliver information, Voldemort's paranoia lingered. "The Dark Lord does not ask twice," Snape once reminded others, a reflection of how even the most faithful had to tread carefully. When Voldemort killed him in the Shrieking Shack, it was not out of cruelty alone, it was an act of suspicion. He believed Snape's allegiance lay with Dumbledore, that his supposed loyalty was just another mask. The irony was that Voldemort's paranoia created the very betrayals he feared. By ruling through terror, he ensured that every follower dreamed of survival rather than service. When the tide of war turned, many Death Eaters fled or betrayed him outright. Even Wormtail, who owed his life to Voldemort, hesitated at the crucial moment. His silver hand, a gift from his master, turned against him when he showed mercy, strangling him as punishment for the smallest act of conscience. It was as if Voldemort's magic itself rejected any trace of loyalty born from humanity. The story of Barty Crouch Jr. also reflects this pattern. Crouch was one of the few Death Eaters who remained genuinely faithful even after Azkaban. His fanaticism was absolute. He escaped the prison, kidnapped Moody, and helped Voldemort return. Yet when his usefulness ended, Voldemort cast him aside without hesitation. Crouch's fate, killed by his own master, proved that loyalty offered no protection. To Voldemort, devotion was never enough. Only control mattered. This same pathology extended even to his Horcruxes, his supposed guarantees of immortality. Each one was hidden, protected by layers of enchantments, because he trusted no living soul to guard them. Not even Bellatrix, whom he used to hide one Horcrux in her vault, knew what it truly was. The irony is sharp. The man who feared betrayal above all else entrusted fragments of his soul to inanimate objects, and yet they too betrayed him when Harry and his friends destroyed them. His entire empire, built on secrecy, collapsed because no one loved him enough to protect what was his. When Voldemort returned to power in the fourth book, his first act was to summon the Death Eaters who had abandoned him. His speech in the graveyard was not one of forgiveness, but of humiliation. 13 years I have waited, he hissed, and you have disappointed me. The gathering was meant to restore unity, but it instead revealed his obsession with punishment. He forced them to kneel, to feel the Cruciatus curse, to remember their place. This was not leadership, it was domination by pain. Fear may win obedience, but it cannot create loyalty. In that graveyard, Voldemort stood alone, surrounded by followers who would sooner lie than love. The distrust reached its peak during the Battle of Hogwarts. Even as his army fought, Voldemort refused to fight alongside them. He operated from the shadows, relying on others to execute his orders. He believed control from afar made him untouchable. Yet this detachment isolated him from reality. When Harry willingly sacrificed himself, Voldemort could not comprehend it. To him, such an act was madness. He was protected by the power he knows not, love. Those words from Dumbledore sealed Voldemort's tragedy. He feared betrayal because he could not imagine devotion without self-interest. Narcissa Malfoy's deception in the Forbidden Forest demonstrates how his mistrust backfired. When she asked Harry if Draco was alive and he answered yes, she lied to Voldemort, declaring Harry dead. It was the final proof that his followers obeyed not from loyalty but from fear. And when fear wavered, his control dissolved. Voldemort's inability to inspire genuine faith left him blind to such moments. He believed he commanded absolute obedience, yet he was surrounded by those waiting for a chance to survive him. In his final moments, Voldemort still saw treachery everywhere but within himself. He blamed his followers, cursed their failures, and sought scapegoats for his downfall. But it was his own mistrust that destroyed him. He underestimated Snape's true allegiance, dismissed the power of sacrifice, and believed fear could replace faith. The wand he stole, the Elder Wand, refused to serve him because it recognized another master. Even the tools of his power turned against him, mirroring the fate of every servant he had ever betrayed. Voldemort's story, at its core, is not just about the fall of a dark wizard, but the collapse of a man who could not trust. The Death Eaters reflected fragments of his fractured soul, devoted yet afraid, powerful yet enslaved. Each one served to reinforce his delusion that control was strength, but control without connection is hollow. In the end, when his curse rebounded and silence filled the Great Hall, Voldemort died exactly as he had lived, alone, surrounded by the ruins of his own suspicion. For all his brilliance, he never understood what Dumbledore once told Harry. "You are protected by your ability to love." Voldemort's fear of betrayal was not unfounded. The betrayal came again and again, but it was of his own making. In pushing others away, he created enemies within his ranks. The Death Eaters were mirrors of his paranoia, bound not by choice but by compulsion. When he looked at them, he saw reflections of himself, frightened, untrusting, desperate for control. That, perhaps, was his truest punishment, to see in every loyal face the echo of his own fear. Voldemort's genius made him a legend, but his distrust made him mortal. Every decision, every suspicion, every act of cruelty stemmed from the same wound, the boy who once sat alone in an orphanage, certain that no one would ever care for him. That boy grew into a man who could conquer death, but never overcome fear. And fear, as Dumbledore once said, is what makes the Dark Lord so strong and so weak. Number 24. What role did Death Eaters play in taking over the Ministry? The takeover of the Ministry of Magic was not a moment of open warfare or roaring spells echoing through its marble halls. It was a silent, methodical suffocation from within. The Death Eaters did not storm the building with wands raised. They slithered through cracks in its foundation, corrupting from the shadows. Long before the day the Ministry fell, whispers had begun to spread. Officials disappeared overnight. Rumors of strange influences circulated, and yet no one dared to question too loudly. For many, it seemed unthinkable that Voldemort's followers could infiltrate the very heart of wizarding authority, but they did. And when they finally revealed themselves, it was already too late. It began with fear. The return of the Dark Lord had thrown the wizarding community into chaos, and fear became the weapon the Death Eaters wielded best. High-ranking officials, including Rufus Scrimgeour, then Minister for Magic, found themselves under constant pressure. The attacks on Muggle-born families and prominent auras were not random acts of terror. They were deliberate acts of psychological warfare. The Ministry, already weakened by years of denial under Cornelius Fudge, was now facing an invisible enemy that thrived on manipulation rather than confrontation. Every department, every corridor, every memo seemed to whisper the same warning. Voldemort was back, and he was watching. When Scrimgeour was murdered, the silence that followed his death spoke louder than any battle could have. It was not just the loss of a leader, it was the loss of the last visible defense between the wizarding world and total darkness. The Ministry has fallen. Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming, were the haunting words broadcast through the air at Bill and Fleur's wedding. Those few sentences, delivered through the enchanted Patronus of Kingsley Shacklebolt, carried the weight of an entire civilization collapsing. The Death Eaters had succeeded in their plan, not through brute strength, but through precise, surgical infiltration. At the center of this infiltration stood Pius Thickness, the puppet minister. Once a respected official in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Thicknesser became a living symbol of the Death Eaters' mastery of control. He was placed under the Imperious Curse, a spell that stripped away his will and turned him into a vessel for Voldemort's orders. His every decree, every policy, every public appearance was scripted by the very people who had murdered his predecessor. The wizarding public, however, saw only a continuation of leadership. Another bureaucrat in a dark suit issuing new regulations. Few realized the truth. The man standing at the podium was no longer his own master. The Death Eaters' control spread like poison through the veins of the Ministry. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement became a parody of its former self, its auras forced to hunt those they once swore to protect. The Wizengamot, the ancient council of magical law, was purged of dissenting voices and replaced with those who bent easily under threat or bribe. Dolores Umbridge, already infamous for her cruelty, rose to prominence once again, this time as the face of the new order. It was under her leadership that the Muggle-born Registration Commission was established, a grotesque institution masquerading as legal reform. Inside the cold, echoing chambers of the Commission, fear was turned into policy. Wizards and witches of Muggle parentage were summoned, questioned, and accused of stealing their magic. Those who could not prove their magical lineage were declared impostors and sent to Azkaban. The trials were public spectacles of humiliation and terror, designed to remind everyone of the new hierarchy, purebloods at the top, everyone else at the mercy of Voldemort's vision. The Death Eaters no longer needed to wear masks. Their ideology had become law. Among the key figures enforcing this order was Yaxley, a ruthless Death Eater whose specialty lay in bureaucratic manipulation. Yaxley infiltrated the very networks that linked the Ministry's communications, ensuring that resistance was silenced before it could form. He was the one who secured Thickness's placement and oversaw the arrests of non-compliant officials. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it is Yaxley who tracks the order of the Phoenix's movements and later boasts about how deeply the Ministry has been compromised. "The place is ours," he sneered, and indeed it was. The Department of Mysteries, once the most secretive branch of magical governance, also fell under the Death Eaters' shadow. The unspeakables, sworn to silence, were easy targets for coercion. Their research into prophecies, time, and the veil between life and death fascinated Voldemort, who viewed their archives as tools for power. The department's secrets were no longer protected for knowledge's sake. They became instruments of domination. Files were seized, experiments halted, and the delicate balance of magical research replaced by the Dark Lord's obsession with immortality. Even the seemingly mundane aspects of Ministry life were corrupted. The Daily Prophet, once a mildly sensationalist newspaper, became a mouthpiece for propaganda. Articles denounced Harry Potter as undesirable number one, claiming he sought to overthrow peace and order. Harry Potter, the so-called Chosen one headline proclaimed, continues to endanger the stability of our world. Behind those words lay the chilling reality. The Death Eaters had not only taken control of the government but of truth itself. Through control of information, they ensured that most witches and wizards accepted the new regime as a necessary response to chaos. Inside the ministry's grand atrium, statues were replaced with monstrous monuments to the new ideology. Where once stood the Fountain of Magical Brethren, a symbol of unity among magical beings, now rose a black sculpture depicting robed wizards crushing naked muggles beneath their feet. The plaque beneath it read, "Magic is might." This was more than decoration, it was indoctrination carved in stone. Every visitor who entered those gilded halls was forced to look upon the embodiment of Voldemort's twisted vision. The ministry had become both fortress and shrine. Resistance was not entirely extinguished, though it flickered dimly. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Arthur Weasley, and a handful of others continued to operate in secrecy, leaking information and aiding fugitives when possible. Yet every act of defiance was a risk of death. The Death Eaters' surveillance stretched everywhere, through enchanted quills, bewitched fireplaces, and informants embedded in every corridor. Even the simplest message required caution. The walls of the ministry seemed to listen, and many whispered that Voldemort himself could sense rebellion. To those who served under the new regime, loyalty was often a mask for survival. Some, like Percy Weasley, found themselves torn between family and duty. Others, like Umbridge, revelled in their newfound authority, using it to settle old grudges and assert their warped sense of order. The boundaries between villain and victim blurred, and that was perhaps the Death Eaters' most effective weapon of all. They created a world where doing nothing seemed safer than doing what was right. The genius of the ministry's takeover lay in its bloodless nature. No armies marched through Diagon Alley, no great magical battles were fought on the ministry's steps. By the time the wizarding public realized they were living under tyranny, every position of power had already been filled with loyalists or slaves. It was, as Hermione once remarked, a revolution done by paperwork and curses. The Death Eaters understood that true control did not require destruction, it required substitution. Replace the minister, rewrite the laws, redefine who the enemy is, and the world will bend itself to your rule. For Voldemort, the conquest of the ministry was the final piece of his long-constructed puzzle. Through it, he gained not only control over the wizarding community, but also legitimacy. No longer a fugitive in the shadows, he ruled from behind an official institution. Every warrant for arrest, every decree against Muggleborns, every execution, each carried the seal of the Ministry of Magic. Evil had never looked so bureaucratic, nor tyranny so neatly filed in parchment and ink. And yet, even in that darkness, hope survived. Deep within the system that the Death Eaters had corrupted, remnants of courage persisted, those who refused to surrender their conscience despite the cost. They smuggled messages, protected the innocent, and waited. For though Voldemort had claimed the ministry, he could not claim the hearts of those who still believed in freedom. The machinery of terror continued to turn, but beneath its grind, the quiet hum of rebellion grew stronger. In the end, the Death Eaters' takeover of the Ministry of Magic stood as one of the most chilling examples of how evil operates not through chaos, but through order. By twisting the very institutions built to protect the people, they transform justice into cruelty and authority into oppression. Their success lay not in open battle, but in the corruption of everyday life, an evil that wore a badge, signed decrees, and smiled from behind a polished desk. The ministry did not fall in a moment of fire, but in a whisper of parchment, sealed with wax, and signed by trembling hands that no longer dared to resist. Number 25. Do Death Eaters still exist after Voldemort's death? When the war ended and the Dark Lord fell, the wizarding world exhaled in relief, but the air still felt thick with the remnants of fear. The Battle of Hogwarts had not only destroyed Voldemort, but had also scattered the remnants of his followers. Some, like Bellatrix Lestrange, perished in combat, consumed by their own madness and devotion. Others, like Lucius Malfoy, surrendered, broken and disillusioned. Yet the shadow of the dark mark never truly vanished. It was not a tattoo of loyalty, it was a brand of ideology, and ideology has a way of surviving even the death of its master. For years, the Ministry of Magic celebrated peace, issuing reports that the last Death Eaters had been imprisoned or neutralized. But people whispered in Diagon Alley and behind closed doors in Nocturne Alley that not all of them had been caught. Some simply disappeared, leaving no trace, no trial, and no redemption. There were stories about fugitives like Thorfinn Roll and Walden McNair who escaped the chaos of the post-war purges. Rumour had it they sought refuge in remote parts of Eastern Europe, where the ministry's authority was weak and old dark magic still thrived in ancient ruins. These were not empty men. They carried the memories of their lord's cruelty like a map, guiding them toward whatever fragments of his power remained hidden in the world. Hermione Granger, years after joining the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, once said during an interview with the Daily Prophet, "Defeating Voldemort didn't mean defeating what created him." Her words captured a quiet truth that few dared to confront. The ideology of the Death Eaters was not born with Voldemort. It was fed by centuries of fear, prejudice, and the seductive promise of purity. Families like the Carrows, the Knotts, and the Selwyns had long histories tied to the belief that wizarding blood should remain untainted. Even without a leader, some of them continued to act according to those beliefs, subtle at first, concealed behind old family traditions, charity foundations, and private gatherings. In the years following the war, mysterious incidents began to occur, cases the ministry could not easily explain. A shipment of cursed artifacts vanished while being transported from the Department of Mysteries to Gringotts. A vault belonging to the family of Antonin Dolohov was broken into, and strange sigils were found burned into the stone walls. When Aura Susan Bones investigated, she reported a faint trace of fiendfire residue, a spell long forbidden and associated with Death Eater attacks. None of these incidents were officially connected to surviving followers, yet to those who had lived through the war, the pattern felt hauntingly familiar. Harry Potter himself could never quite shake the feeling that something lingered. Even years after becoming head of the Aura office, he sometimes woke in the middle of the night, imagining the faint burn of the lightning scar that no longer hurt. Once, during a private conversation with Kingsley Shacklebolt, he admitted that he occasionally saw the dark mark, not in the sky, but in dreams. In one of his letters to Hermione, he wrote, "Sometimes I wonder if evil ever dies, or if it just waits for a quieter generation to forget it exists." The unease in his words resonated with many who had fought beside him. There were whispers about a gathering in Albania where Voldemort had once hidden in the form of a wraith. Local wizards spoke of a cloaked figure who preached about the restoration of magical supremacy. It could have been a fraud, a charlatan feeding on the myth of the Dark Lord, but the details were chillingly precise. Eyewitnesses mentioned a serpent tattoo glowing faintly on the speaker's arm. The ministry dismissed it as superstition, but older auras, including Neville Longbottom, kept silent watch. They remembered too well how the world had once ignored the first signs. Draco Malfoy, though publicly reformed, carried the burden of his family's legacy. He once confided to a friend that owls still arrived at his manor from unknown senders, letters unsigned, written in an archaic script, sealed with black wax. He burned them all without reading, but the thought that someone still knew where to reach him was a wound that never closed. Narcissa Malfoy, who had once lied to save Harry's life, lived in seclusion, guarding her son with a quiet desperation. Even redemption did not erase suspicion. Among certain pure-blood circles, her family name was still whispered with reverence, as if the Malfoys had merely been biding their time. One of the more disturbing cases came from a remote village in Scotland, where farmers found their livestock dead and marked with runes resembling the shape of the Dark Mark. The Aurors who investigated found traces of potion ingredients, nightshade, acromantula venom, and unicorn blood. It was the last substance that terrified them most. To spill the blood of a unicorn was an act reserved for the most desperate and corrupted. The report was quietly buried, marked unverified ritual activity. But those who saw the evidence believed it was a sign. Someone was trying to replicate the Dark Lord's path to immortality. If Voldemort's power had come from splitting his soul, perhaps some of his followers sought a different kind of resurrection, not of body, but of belief. They gathered what they could, broken wands, cursed relics, books that had survived the fire in the Room of Requirement. The Liber Tenebris, a manuscript once thought destroyed, resurfaced in a private collection. It contained instructions for binding one's will to another through blood magic, creating not Horcruxes, but echoes of obedience. A note scrawled on its final page read, "The Dark Lord shall never die while his servants remember his name." This ideology became something new, a cult without a leader, bound not by orders but by memory. They no longer needed the name Death Eater. They met in ruins, in abandoned castles, beneath the forest canopy where no Patronus light could reach. They called themselves the Silent Circle. The group's existence was never proven, yet peculiar coincidences followed them. A series of fires near old pure-blood estates, mysterious disappearances of ministry clerks handling records of former Death Eaters, and even the theft of Tom Riddle's ring from its protected vault. The ring was later found in pieces, as if someone had been trying to rebuild it. Luna Lovegood, known for her strange insights, once remarked during a lecture at Hogwarts, "Evil is like a Nagel. You think it's gone when you can't see it, but it only hides behind the mistletoe." Many laughed, but Harry understood. Darkness in the wizarding world did not vanish, it adapted. For every law Hermione wrote, for every arrest Harry ordered, there were those who worked quietly to undo it, believing that history would turn in their favor again. Some said the resurgence would not come through old Death Eaters, but through their children. Young witches and wizards raised in bitterness and shame began asking questions about their parents' past. The son of one known Death Eater, Scorpius Malfoy, grew up under scrutiny, struggling to redefine what his name meant. But there were others, less public, who found the forbidden fascinating rather than shameful. In secret dueling clubs and shadow libraries they whispered the old incantations, curious about the power their parents once held. Ideology passed down in silence can become a seed, and even one seed, given time, can grow into a forest. In Tothe 22, an Auror patrol discovered a hidden chamber beneath the ruins of Riddle Manor. Inside they found remnants of dark ritual circles and a mural depicting a phoenix burning, a symbol many interpreted as mockery of Dumbledore's order. But what caught attention was a single phrase painted in ash. "He taught us fear. We shall teach them patience." The handwriting was inconsistent, as if several people had written it together. No fingerprints, no magical residue, only the faint echo of enchantments that resisted identification. It was a warning, or perhaps a promise. For all the Ministry's vigilance, the true danger of the Death Eaters was never their magic, it was their belief in inevitability. Voldemort convinced them that darkness was the natural order, that mercy was weakness. Some still believe that. When Harry visited the ruins of Hogwarts on the 10th anniversary of the battle, he stood where Voldemort had fallen and felt, for a brief moment, a chill in the wind that seemed to whisper words he hoped never to hear again. There is no good and evil, there is only power. Years have passed, and yet the question remains unanswered. Do the Death Eaters still exist? Perhaps not as before, not as an army, but as an infection buried deep within the world they once sought to control. Some of them live quietly now, their wands gathering dust, their names forgotten. But in the quiet corners of old libraries, in the flicker of cursed candles, and in the hearts of those who crave dominion, the dark mark might still pulse faintly beneath the skin, waiting for the moment when someone brave or foolish enough calls it to life again. And if that day comes, the scar on Harry Potter's forehead may burn once more, reminding the world that the past is never truly dead. It only sleeps. Number 26, who remained dangerous even without Voldemort. There are moments in the Harry Potter saga that remind readers how fragile the boundary is between power and madness. Among Voldemort's followers, the Death Eaters, not all were merely shadows of their master's will. Some existed as independent forces of cruelty, thriving in chaos and violence long after the Dark Lord's fall. When Voldemort vanished after his first defeat, many of his servants hid or claimed innocence, but a few continued their dark acts with disturbing passion. They did not require his mark to guide them. Their allegiance was not to a cause, but to the thrill of dominance. These individuals embodied the darkest corners of human nature, where sadism met mastery of the dark arts. Antonin Dolohov stands as one of the most chilling examples. His reputation was not built on fear alone, but on skill, precise, silent, and merciless. He fought not for power, but for the pure execution of it. During the First Wizarding War, Dolohov murdered Fabian and Gideon Prewett, two of the Order of the Phoenix's most formidable members. Even Alastor Moody himself acknowledged that the brothers fought like heroes, yet they were no match for Dolohov. He did not rely on loud incantations or the presence of comrades. His magic struck swiftly and without warning, often leaving no trace but silence at death. The Ministry of Magic feared him for his unpredictability, for his ability to kill without hesitation or remorse. His technique was as terrifying as it was elegant. In the Department of Mysteries battle, his duel with Hermione Granger revealed his cruel precision. A streak of purple flame passed so close to Hermione's face that her hair caught fire, the book recounts. That curse, silent and deadly, incapacitated her instantly, leaving her motionless on the ground. It was only later revealed that the spell he used was one of his own invention, a mark of magical ingenuity corrupted by malice. Dolohov was not a servant in the usual sense. He was a craftsman of pain. Even stripped of Voldemort's leadership, he carried his violence like a personal creed. In contrast, Alecto and Amicus Carrow represented a different form of danger. They were not tactical geniuses or inventors of new spells. Their weapon was psychological cruelty, the pleasure of domination disguised as loyalty. When Voldemort placed them in charge of Hogwarts after Dumbledore's death, he did not need to instruct them in terror. They already knew how to twist authority into suffering. As professors, Alecto taught Muggle studies, turning it into a course on hatred. She called Muggles filthy and subhuman, forcing students to repeat her slurs as lessons. Amicus, who taught the dark arts, went further, making students perform cruciatus curses on their classmates as punishment. The Carrows transformed Hogwarts, once a sanctuary of learning, into a fortress of humiliation and fear. Their reign was a reflection of Voldemort's vision, not because they were told what to do, but because cruelty was their natural language. Neville Longbottom later recalled that they made us torture people who disobeyed. The Carrows found in the castle a laboratory for their depravity. They relished the absence of oversight, the freedom to experiment with fear. Even without Voldemort's immediate orders, they flourished in his ideology like parasites feeding on chaos. What made such Death Eaters particularly dangerous was not their loyalty to a fallen master, but their independence within evil. Dolohov did not crumble after Voldemort's first defeat. He continued to harbour hatred, nursing it like a weapon. The Carrows, too, did not join out of devotion to the Dark Lord's ideals of purity, but because tyranny gave them identity. These figures showed that the dark arts were not merely tools, they were extensions of the self. Voldemort's disappearance only unmasked who among his followers truly believed in darkness, not as ideology, but as instinct. Dolohov's past hints at this deep corruption. During his time in Azkaban, witnesses claimed he was silent, emotionless, and patient. When the Dementors opened the gates for Voldemort's return, Dolohov did not seek revenge for imprisonment. He sought continuation. He did not need encouragement. His hatred was sustained from within. This inner drive separated him from lesser Death Eaters who faltered without direction. Many of them wore masks out of fear or ambition. Dolohov wore his as a second skin. Similarly, the Carrows never exhibited devotion beyond the convenience of power. Their cruelty was opportunistic. When Voldemort fell, they did not attempt to avenge him. They hid, waiting for the next chance to torment the weak. This adaptability made them resilient. Evil, in their case, was not ideology but appetite. In every era of conflict, such people rise, those who do not serve a cause but feed on its chaos. The wizarding world feared Voldemort, but it was the likes of Dolohov and the Carrows who reminded it that evil could survive even when its symbol was gone. The Death Eaters' hierarchy often obscured the individuality of their crimes. Voldemort inspired collective terror, but within his ranks were unique shades of cruelty. Dolohov was a duelist of death, capable of felling trained auras with a flick of his wand. His spell work required no grand gestures. It was quiet, like the stillness before a storm. The Carrows, meanwhile, turned discipline into degradation. Their victims did not die instantly, they lived to remember. Each act of punishment was a lesson in despair. When they punished students by forcing them to hurt others, they turned children into unwilling participants of darkness. That perhaps was more devastating than death. Another layer of danger lay in their ability to blend into normalcy. Dolohov could appear unremarkable in a crowd, his expression calm, his demeanor controlled. He killed with the efficiency of someone who understood human weakness. The Carrows, though repulsive in character, wielded institutional power. They were educators, perversions of trust. It was not necessary for them to cast unforgivable curses daily. Their authority alone crushed spirits. In this way, they represented two faces of corruption, one born of skill, the other of position. Even after Voldemort's final defeat, rumors persisted that Dolohov survived. Some said he vanished into Eastern Europe, seeking new followers among dark sorcerers. The Ministry never confirmed his capture. The thought itself is haunting, that such a man could roam free, unbound by ideology, guided only by his mastery of death. His story warns that evil refined through discipline becomes nearly impossible to extinguish. He was not loud, not chaotic. He was deliberate. That made him terrifying. The Carrow's fate, on the other hand, was public and pitiful. Captured after the Battle of Hogwarts, they were sent to Azkaban, stripped of their titles, their cruelty reduced to memory. Yet the damage they inflicted remained. Generations of students carried the trauma of their reign. The scars were invisible but enduring. Their downfall revealed a truth, that while power fades, the consequences of sadism do not. They had taught an entire school how fragile goodness could be under tyranny. It is this lingering shadow that makes such Death Eaters more horrifying than Voldemort himself. The Dark Lord's power relied on fear and myth. Once he was gone, faith in his invincibility collapsed, but those who internalized his cruelty continued to spread it like disease. Evil survives not in the name of a leader, but in the habits of those who once served him. Dolohov's silent spells, the Carrow's lessons of hate, these were echoes of Voldemort's ideology, still whispering in the corners of the wizarding world. There is a telling moment in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows when McGonagall faces the Carrows. She sees not opponents of war, but perversions of education. They had twisted the very soul of Hogwarts. That confrontation underscored the difference between dark power and dark pleasure. Voldemort sought control, the Carrows sought degradation, Dolohov sought perfection of destruction. In these differences lies the essence of why some Death Eaters remain dangerous. Their evil was personal, not borrowed. When we think of the Death Eaters, it is tempting to imagine them as mere extensions of Voldemort's will. But the truth, as Dumbledore once implied, is more unsettling. It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. Dolohov and the Carrows chose darkness not out of obedience but conviction. They revealed that cruelty, when self-sustained, outlasts even the mightiest tyrant. Their stories remind readers that the greatest threat to peace is not the rise of a single Dark Lord, but the persistence of those who never stopped enjoying his reign. In the end, the fall of Voldemort was not the end of his legacy. The world rebuilt itself, yet whispers of those who once thrived under his shadow remained. Dolohov's name lingered like a curse spoken in secret. The Carrows became symbols of corruption within authority, warnings of what happens when cruelty is given legitimacy. They were living evidence that evil does not die with its master. It adapts, evolves, and waits. The true danger was never Voldemort's magic. It was the human hunger for domination that survived him. Number 29. Why did the Ministry ignore their return for so long? When Lord Voldemort began to regain his body and his strength, the wizarding world stood at the edge of a precipice. And yet the Ministry of Magic, blinded by arrogance and fear, refused to see the abyss before it. Cornelius Fudge, then Minister for Magic, chose denial over duty. His refusal to acknowledge the signs of Voldemort's return became not merely a political mistake, but a moral failure that allowed the Death Eaters to regroup, to rebuild, and to infiltrate the very system that should have destroyed them. The question of why the Ministry ignored the return of the Death Eaters is not only a story of political blindness, but one of human weakness, the fear of losing power. In those dark months after the Triwizard Tournament, when Harry Potter returned from the graveyard of Little Hangleton, carrying the body of Cedric Diggory and the unbearable truth that Voldemort had returned, the Ministry's first instinct was not to protect, but to discredit. Cornelius Fudge, faced with Harry's testimony and Dumbledore's solemn confirmation, refused to accept the truth. "He's not back," Fudge insisted, trembling but resolute, his mind already seeking the political consequences of such an admission. For the minister, it was easier to call the boy who lived a liar than to face the reality of another war. Fudge's fear was not the fear of Voldemort. It was the fear of losing control. The First Wizarding War had scarred the Ministry's reputation. Admitting the Dark Lord's return would mean admitting their own inability to prevent it. The machinery of bureaucracy cannot coexist with the chaos of prophecy and rebellion. Fudge feared Dumbledore's influence just as much as he feared Voldemort's power. In his eyes, acknowledging the return of the Dark Lord might strengthen Dumbledore's claim as a wartime leader. Thus, political jealousy disguised itself as skepticism, and the truth was buried beneath layers of denial. Meanwhile, the Death Eaters, thought to be scattered and powerless, began to move quietly under the cover of this denial. Lucius Malfoy, reinstated as a respectable member of wizarding society, used his wealth and influence to manipulate the Ministry itself. He attended charity galas, donated to magical institutions, and whispered poison into political ears. Behind the facade of reform, the Death Eaters were rebuilding their network. The Ministry, blind to their resurgence, saw only polished manners and generous donations. They did not see the tattoos hidden beneath silk sleeves. The denial reached its most dangerous peak when the Ministry began a campaign to silence dissent. The Daily Prophet, once a neutral publication, became a mouthpiece of propaganda. Articles dismissed Harry Potter as disturbed and Dumbledore as senile. The public, lulled by the comfort of denial, preferred the illusion of safety over the discomfort of vigilance. The Death Eaters, sensing this complacency, expanded their influence. They understood that when a government fears truth, lies become law. One specific event stands as a symbol of the Ministry's blindness, the Azkaban breakout. In the fifth book, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, a mass escape of Death Eaters took place, releasing notorious criminals such as Bellatrix Lestrange and Antonin Dolohov. The Ministry, rather than admitting that Voldemort had orchestrated it, insisted the prisoners had merely overpowered guards in an isolated incident. It was an absurd explanation, one that only deepened public confusion. Fudge's Ministry did not see this as an act of war. They saw it as an inconvenient rumor to suppress. This deliberate blindness created the perfect breeding ground for corruption. Dolores Umbridge, appointed as Hogwarts High Inquisitor, personified the Ministry's obsession with control. Instead of preparing young witches and wizards for defense, she ordered them to read textbooks and repeat slogans. "Wands away," she said. "There will be no need for such barbaric displays." In that moment, the Ministry was not defending children, it was disarming them. Voldemort did not need to destroy Hogwarts, the Ministry was doing it for him. By the time the Ministry began to suspect the truth, Voldemort had already infiltrated it. Death Eaters like Pius Thickness and Yaxley wormed their way into key administrative roles. Information flowed from the heart of the Ministry straight to Voldemort's inner circle. When Fudge was replaced by Rufus Scrimgeour, the change came too late. The enemy was no longer outside the gates. It was sitting in the offices, writing memos, drafting decrees, shaping the law. The system had been conquered from within. The tragedy of Fudge's leadership lies in his inability to distinguish calm from safety. In one chilling moment, Dumbledore says, "The truth. It is a beautiful and terrible thing and should therefore be treated with great caution." Fudge treated truth not with caution but with contempt. He believed that controlling the narrative could control reality. He underestimated both Voldemort's cunning and the resilience of those who served him. Every denial, every smear campaign, every suppression of facts became a weapon, not against Voldemort, but against the very people trying to stop him. What makes this period so haunting is how ordinary it seemed. There were no dark clouds over the ministry, no immediate signs of danger. People still went to work, still sent their children to Hogwarts, still shopped at Diagon Alley. The quiet before the storm was filled with bureaucratic reports and cheerful headlines. But beneath the surface, the Death Eaters were reshaping the wizarding world into their image. Subtle changes in policy, whispers of fear, and the gradual erasure of dissenting voices. Evil rarely returns with thunder. It seeps in through the cracks of complacency. Consider Lucius Malfoy again, the symbol of this double life. At public events he posed as a philanthropist, even donating to St. Mungo's Hospital. In private he attended secret meetings with the Dark Lord. His influence within the ministry helped ensure that certain investigations were quietly dropped, and certain wizards conveniently promoted. Fudge saw in Malfoy a powerful ally, not realizing that he was shaking hands with betrayal. The ministry's blindness was not only ideological but personal, a refusal to see evil in those who wore fine robes and smiled politely. The manipulation extended beyond politics into law enforcement. The Auror Office, once a bastion of justice, was constrained by bureaucratic red tape. Kingsley Shacklebolt and Nymphadora Tonks operated with increasing frustration as their efforts to expose Death Eater activity were met with skepticism or obstruction. Files disappeared, reports were lost. Witnesses were silenced under the guise of confidentiality. Each small act of ignorance became a brick in the fortress of Voldemort's rise. Even when undeniable proof surfaced, the attack on the Department of Mysteries, for instance, Fudge hesitated. Only when he saw Voldemort with his own eyes, standing in the atrium of the ministry, did the truth become undeniable. The image of the Dark Lord materializing amid golden fireplaces shattered years of denial in seconds. But by then, the damage was done. The Death Eaters were organized, the Order of the Phoenix was weakened, and the public trust was broken. Voldemort had achieved what every tyrant dreams of, conquering minds before conquering lands. The irony of the ministry's denial is that it strengthened the very forces it feared. By labeling the truth as hysteria, it made the defenders of truth seem unreliable. By discrediting Dumbledore, it isolated the one man who could have united the wizarding world. When truth becomes dangerous, lies become comforting. The Death Eaters thrived in that comfort, expanding their reach under the shadow of official silence. "You are blinded," Dumbledore once told Fudge, "by the love of the office you hold." In that blindness, the seeds of destruction were sown.